Okay, so we can read contrast and we can read basic color balance using the Luma waveform and the RGB parade. We've got one more scope to cover before we get along to the fun stuff, and that is what we call the vector scope. Now, the Luma waveform allows us to read contrast. The RGB parade allows us to read RGB values and, by extension, color balance of our image. And the vector scope allows us to read both hue and saturation. So first, let's bring the vector scope up from our familiar drop-down menu. I'm going to click and choose vector scope, and I get this kind of clock face looking diagram in the lower right. So first, let's define some key terms. Hue is the actual color, red, green, blue, etc. And saturation is the strength of that color, or how colorful that particular hue is in whatever part of the screen we are looking at. Any true neutral color has zero saturation. That's black, grey, white, it doesn't matter how bright it is. And if I go onto the grey gradient here, you'll see that almost nothing shows up on the scope in the lower right hand side. So let's look at this scope and how we read it. So the first thing I want to make clear about the vector scope is that it does not give us any position information at all. So I'm going to do our little alignment trick. Now, there is no positional information on this scope whatsoever, X or Y, whatever. It only allows us to read both hue and saturation. So if I want to tell which part of the image has a particular hue or saturation, I'm going to have to do that by cross-referencing the image in my viewer with this scope. I cannot intuit where anything is by looking at the scope alone, which makes this different from the other two scopes that we've looked at. So let's talk through the anatomy of the vector scope and look at a few gradients and then finally a real image once again. I have a central crosshair, and then I have an outer border, and I've got 6 little targets, and they're labelled R for red, M for magenta, B for blue, C for cyan, G for green, and Y for yellow. These are the 6 vector hue indicators. Each one indicates either a primary or secondary colour, and we can have any number of different colours between 2 of these targets. You can see a white reading reaching out from the centre here, and the direction in which it is pointing denotes the hue. So the target that this reading is pointing towards is the hue. In this case, this white reading is going straight through the red target because we only have red hues in this image. And the distance the white reading reaches out from the centre of the scope is the saturation. The further out the reading goes, the more saturated the colour, and the less saturated the colour, the closer it gets to the centre. Now I've chosen another gradient here because it makes this very easy to see. On the left hand side of the screen we're at black, which has a saturation value of 0, and then we go all the way through to a very bright primary red with the maximum possible saturation for red in this colour space. And we have every single value in between, which is what creates this white line. If I quickly draw a window around this, and what we can see is if I drag to the left and exclude the more saturated parts of the image, the reading doesn't go out as far. But if I remove the other parts of the image, and I'll just make this a hard border, you can see what we're getting is that the white reading doesn't really start at the centre. We've got a very thin line which reaches down to the centre because of the border that this window is creating, but otherwise we just have the more saturated values. So the direction in which your reading is pointing is the colour, and the distance it reaches out from the centre is the saturation. So let's take a look at green. Now this one's just shy of the green target. It's not gone straight through the centre of the green target, and it's a little bit closer to the yellow target. We can see Y on the left hand side. And this corroborates with what we saw in the RGB parade exercise earlier. This is a very slightly yellow-green. It's not a perfectly primary pure green colour. So we can also see that corroborated here as well. And now for blue, again, we've gone from the center to the maximum saturation value, and the same here. This is a pure blue. It goes straight through the center of the target. It starts at 0, goes out to the maximum possible saturation value. So this is fairly easy to read when we only have one color. But let's take a look at what it looks like on a multicolored frame. And here I have the standard radial gradient that I'm sure we've all made once in Photoshop. We always use this radial gradient tool and do this at least once. I certainly did. But it's quite a useful tool to show how hue and saturation are measured, and also presented on the vector scope. So we have basically every possible hue here, and they're all at their maximum possible saturation values. So the reason we have this kind of hexagonal outline, this kind of rupee from Legend of Zelda looking pattern here, is that we've started at red, but we can see we go to yellow and we get all the intermediary hues in between, all the different oranges and reds and yellows in between the two, and they're what describe this line. And then the same from yellow to green, and green to cyan, cyan to blue, and so on. We get all of the possible hues here, and they are all at the maximum saturation value, so we get them describing the kind of maximum limits of saturation we can see on this scope. So this outline, this hexagon, looks a bit skewed, and different colours have different possible values of maximum saturation, depending on the gamut in which we're working, and we will talk about gamut later on. So don't worry about it not being a perfect hexagon. This is kind of what we're looking at here. It's just hue, colour, and saturation, the strength of that colour. And just to hammer home that we don't get any position information here, if I make this spin, you can see we get little bits of glowing here as different colour values kind of dance around a bit, but it otherwise doesn't move. And that's because we don't get any position information on this scope, so no matter how this moves, this shape is not going to change. So let's take a look at a real shot. One thing that we might want to do, and we'll go over this again later, is to hold Alt or Option and hit F. And that's going to clear out the top half of our UI and give us much more space to work within the viewer, and thus get a much better view of our image. And I can just scroll in and drag the middle click to move this image around. This is a good way to work if we don't have an external reference monitor, but we'll go over those much later in the course. So I've got my image here, and what I will do is I will increase the saturation so that it's easier to read on the scope. We will go over all the primary controls in good time in the next section of the course, so don't worry about that. I've just increased the saturation to make it easier to read. And if I change the saturation, of course, like any other scope, the vector scope updates in real time. And if an image is black and white, you get a single dot right in the center. And if an image is very colorful, you get a reading that reaches further and further out from the center of the vector scope. So let's look at what we're seeing here. There are a few key things we look for with the vector scope. It's particularly good for skin tones, which we'll cover in a second. So I can see I've got a blue reading, a blue cyan reading reaching quite far out, a reasonably saturated blue cyan. That is all of the blue in the graphics on the wall, and the graffiti on the wall in the background. And we can see the range of different hues reaching out from the center here. That's what these represent. Very often, the things that look like a pure color are not. They're kind of between the two targets. That's normal. You don't have to get a lot of things right at a particular target. In fact, right through the blue target can look a little bit purple. It can look a little bit kind of magenta sometimes because we're seeing everything within the context of other colors in the frame, and we'll talk more about how that impacts color perception later on. I've got a red spike going quite far and right towards the red target, and that's the rose here on the left-hand side. I can see that it's a little bit pinkish, it's a little bit more blue and magenta, and sure enough, this red reading down here is not going straight for the red target, it's a little bit to the right. Now, I'll show you a trick which can make reading the vector scope a little bit easier. If I hit the abacus, what I can do is I can hit the checkbox here which says show 2x zoom. And when I do that, it will double the size of my reading. And this can make my vector scope much easier to read. but this can trip you up later if you forget that you've already zoomed in on it, so just keep this in mind. Now I've got a green leaf as well, and I've got a small green spike coming down here. It's a slightly bluish green. We can see the green spike is going off and kind of yawing out between green and cyan, and sure enough I've got a bluish cool green up here as well. So that's how I can start to break down all of these different features that I see using the vector scope. Using this tool, I can quickly look at a colour and go, that's a little bit weak. What I want to do is make it stronger, or, oh, that's kind of going crazy, I need to bring it down. I need to make sure nothing in the frame is going to be distracting, and make sure it's not going to disrupt the way we look at the image. If this red flower on the left-hand side here was super colourful, that would be really distracting. We wouldn't want that. So this is a really good tool to make sure that things are the proper colour they're meant to be, and that they're not going to be a little bit too high or a little bit too colourful. And on the vector scope, this red flower here certainly does look too colourful. In fact, it's almost the most colourful thing on the image. Some of the skin tones here are just about equal to it in terms of saturation. Now, the last thing we're going to go over on the vector scope is the most important thing, and it's how to make a good reading of skin tones. Now, if I hit the abacus again, this little icon here, I can choose the skin tone indicator down here at the bottom. And if I do that, this little white line appears, and it's kind of 2/3 of the way or 3/4 of the way towards the red target. This is what we call the eye line, or the skin tone line. It indicates what is widely believed to be the ideal hue for skin tones in a film. Now, of course, that statement is ridiculous. There's no such thing as an ideal skin tone. And this is kind of an old idea. It used to be we stuck to it very rigorously. We don't anymore. Depending on the actual skin tones of the actor you're working with, you might go 15 degrees either north or south of this line. You're never going to go straight to the yellow target or straight to the red target, but we will stay within, let's say, 5 minutes if this is a clock face, maybe 5 minutes either side of this line, and that's all fine. It depends on what kind of skin your actor has. Now, there is no such thing as an ideal skin tone, but we do want things to fall close to this line, because if I change my hue and things go green or yellow, we start to see that really, really quickly. Skin tones start to look off if the hue is out very, very quickly indeed, as you can see here. And the reason for this is that skin tones are what we call a memory colour. Now, we'll discuss that further in detail later on, but basically we can immediately spot when they're wrong, so we have to take great care with them. So we do want our skin tones to be within a small distance either side of the eye line, and depending on the colour of our background, what other colours are going on in the frame, we can get away with a bit more deviation from that line sometimes, but we'll talk about that much later on. So this has been a decent overview of the vector scope. It is one of the more abstract tools you use within Resolve. Once you get your head behind the kind of exposition brightness idea of the other two scopes, they're quite easy to read. But the vector scope is a bit weird at first because there's no position data there at all. So, and you know this is coming, I want you to go through and try to read a few of the shots you've got. Now, they're all in log gamma, so they're going to be quite washed out and quite desaturated, which makes them difficult to read on the vector scope. So remember the abacus and the 2x zoom trick that we saw earlier on. That will make your shots much easier to read. I'm going to take mine back to normal because I've already increased the saturation here. And remember to turn 2x zoom off once you're done. So go ahead and click on through to the next lecture once you're ready, because we're finally going to start grading, and that is where all of